Lead with Love is brought to you by Alex and Steph from Dreams Financial. When I was looking for a new financial advisor, I had a checklist in my mind of what that relationship would look like. I knew I wanted someone who didn't just talk at me, but strategized with me. Enter Alex and Steph. They get how important it is that I understand where my money is going and why, and they help me get clarity on how to make it work for me. I trust them with my investments, and you can too. Visit them at dreamsfinancial.ca for more. Welcome back to Lead with Love. I'm your host, Cynthia Iorio. Today we're going to talk about something that I used to perceive as a weakness, and that's denial. Denial was an emotion that I used to see as somebody's willingness or somebody's unwillingness to face a difficult situation. It was a weakness, and it was something that I judged pretty harshly until I was very aware of how denial was playing a role in my life. And what I've come to really realize about denial is that it's actually less about weakness and more about survival. It really is an emotion that helps protect us and helps get us to the next level. And it's basically self-preservation. I was having a conversation with a girlfriend recently whose father was diagnosed with cancer. And we were talking about, so she contacted me towards the beginning or really soon after her father was diagnosed, and was looking for my guidance on something tactically. She wanted to find a nutritionist to help her dad because he was about to embark on some chemotherapy treatments. And so I kind of gave her that guidance, and I treaded lightly with anything else that she had, was going to ask me for, or any other guidance I was still wanting to give her, but, everybody is on their own respective journey. And then a couple of weeks later, she and I had a follow-up conversation just based on what her experience was. Again, she had reached out to me. And, one of the things we were talking about was just how incredible, how intense the influx of information is when somebody that you love now needs your care. And I'm being careful about using those words because I know that my experience and the experience of the friend of mine that I just talked about is around, illness, but we're even talking about, diagnosis of autism, for example, in children. And so it's just, whenever I want to be careful about how I talk about caregiving and caregivers, because a family member who needs care is also someone who just maybe has a new challenge in their life and is facing something that very clear they will not be able to handle on their own. And so this influx of information that comes towards us, our brains just have a very hard time. They almost like they shut down. It's so much. You have this emotional feelings that the emotions that you're processing in dealing with learning the news of this thing that's happening to your loved one. Then it's the immediate need to process, okay, what are all the things that we have to do in the short term? Then it's the fear and, when your brain will ramble and the anxiety sets in when you're thinking down the line of all the possible things that could happen. And then, ultimately thinking about how your life is going to change as a result of needing to care for this person. So there's just this massive influx of information that comes into your brain. And then you're not capable of receiving any other information. You're not capable of hearing anything else. And to me, that's a form of self-preservation. It's a form of denial because you're not necessarily grasping everything, but that's the brain's way of protecting itself. Another way I like to think about denial is basically when we went through COVID. When the announcements came through that the world was going to be shutting down for 2 weeks, and then possibly 2 months, and then possibly a year. I mean, I remember myself, I was like, there's absolutely no way that I'm going to be able to, or that they're going to do that. And I'm just going to put it out of my head. I'm not going to deal with that. I'm not going to listen to it. And I'll put one foot in front of the other until 2 weeks did turn into 2 months, did turn into 4 months, did turn into, we're living in Montreal almost a year later. And again, it's self-preservation, right? Because just the sheer thought of what could happen, or the fact that you would be locked down in your house for an entire year weighed me down, and I wouldn't be able to move forward. So it's the same thing when you realize you're about to become a caregiver. You can't eat an elephant in all one bite. You have to take little bites. And that's the same thing with the caregiver role. It's just learning what's going to come along until you become good at something, and then your brain opens itself up and allows you to take on more information. The other thing that is really difficult about denial is that you might see things very, very clearly, but you may have family members around you in the support network of the person that you are now in the responsibility of caring for who are in denial. And that is very, very difficult. It adds an element of complexity to an already stressful situation. And when people don't necessarily step up in the way that you hope, when people don't step up or are not willing or capable of meeting you at a place where you are, it could be extremely isolating, and it could be extremely sad. And that's heavy, period. I met Sabrina proper at the Caregivers Summit back in November. And she's a psychotherapist and social worker with the Jewish Family and Child Services in Toronto. She and I had a conversation after the summit, and I asked her what she thought about her experience. She went in a professional capacity, but what she thought about her experience. And it was really interesting what she had to say.
I don't think I knew really what to expect when I first entered into the space. I went as a professional. I went with the mindset of somebody who works in this space and supports caregivers. I didn't realize how much it would impact me personally, listening to so many of the areas that are not commonly, so many of the individuals who are not commonly identified as caregivers, such as the young caregivers, such as siblings, which are the areas that I have fallen into in my life. I was like, oh, I never thought of myself as a caregiver, which I think was a common response throughout the entire summit that we kept hearing, is that people often do not identify themselves as a caregiver. So yeah, I mean, professionally, I think it was great. And I have shared a lot of the information that I received with the families that I do work with. But again, I think the greatest impact for me was actually personally.
Tell me a little bit more about when you say personally, like when you walked away and you reflected on your experience, which I'm going to get into a little bit. When you reflected on that, how did what you learned change the way you maybe reframed or framed your experience when you were younger?
So I think that it was really the young carers area that I sat, the group that I sat and listened to, where I was really taken aback, thinking to myself, wow, like I have literally been a caregiver since probably the day I was born. And certainly since I was able to be a caregiver, never would I have identified that. So I have a brother with a developmental disability. So he's older than myself. So he's 4 years older than me. So when I say the day I was born, that's because, it is just the two of us. And I have always been a caregiver. I have very vivid memories of even being like 4 or 5 years old and like taking his hand and like, at camp or wherever we were and kind of guiding him. But more than that, my father at also a very young age had a traumatic brain injury when I was 4. And for numerous reasons that we don't need to get into because that's a whole other podcast, my parents separated just due to the things that led up to the accident that caused the head injury. And as a result of that, he was living on his own in Hamilton. I am from Toronto. I live in Toronto. And my aunt was his primary caregiver at the time. But as soon as I was able to drive, essentially, I suddenly was placed in this role of being my father's caregiver as well. Although in some ways resented that role a lot, very different. And I always respond very differently than for my brother. Listening to those young carers, I really realized like I had already established this identity as a carer, that it wasn't even a choice to me to turn around and say, no, like this father who essentially has not been a part of my life since I was a baby, like this is not my responsibility. Like I never was even able to even get there. So listening to some of those young carers, when I was thinking to myself, like, why did they feel the need that they have to take this on? It was like an aha moment to me. I was like, why did I feel the need to take that on? So yeah, I think that was the biggest thing I really walked away with, just when I talk about the impact it had on self.
It's wild to me to think that Sabrina had lived very clearly this experience of being a caregiver for her sibling and then for her father, and it just was not clear to her. And that is also the brain's form of denial for the brain. It's the brain's way of saying, well, we're just doing this, we're moving through life, and that denial will also suppress emotions maybe that we haven't processed and keep them locked away. It's wild to me that she saw that or didn't see that. Katrina is a passionate caregiving advocate motivated by her own experience for caregiving for her mother as well as her grandmother. And I talked to her a little bit about what it was like to process all that information at the beginning of her mother's diagnosis with Alzheimer's. So what was the learning process like once you, like, did you throw yourself into the learning? Was it stumble and...
Oh my God, it was like, put on your helmet. Like we ended up getting a diagnosis, which was terrible. I mean, I learned pretty quickly that the medical system was not going to be supportive and that there were no resources. Every time I found something out, it was like as if actually felt like someone was punching me in the gut. Like I couldn't believe it. I was in shock. Okay, your mom's living with dementia, just call the Alzheimer's Society. Oh, okay. I'm going to call and everything will get better. They're going to help us. That's not what happened. Right? Like I thought a team was going to come in and help, but that doesn't exist. So it was sink or swim. I really invented our own way through it. A lot of terrible things happened. Every day was a new crisis. If I wasn't a producer, would I have gotten through it? I don't know. Because I have producers or crisis
managers. Yeah,
that's all we're doing. So it was that kind of perspective for me, and knowing how to get things done and not taking no for an answer. Like, okay, oh, well, but we could try this. So there's always a third option. Here's a suggestion. I was always doing that. But, I didn't even realize I had to do that at first. At first I was still relying on the system and thinking things were going to be like someone was going to help us, right? Like,
I remember when my mom got sick and we had the diagnosis, I almost expected someone to just like hand me this book. Like, okay, boom, here we go. Now you're in this situation and, you're now in this role and these are the things you can expect. And here are the places that you can consult. And here's how you're going to manage the medications and the this and the that, because I'm a project manager by trade. So similarly to producer being in crisis management, I just had this expectation that there is this way that we're going to deal with this. And very true, similarly to you, it was like whacking the weeds and trying to figure it out and reinvent the wheel as we go. Meanwhile, I would be sitting in these hospital rooms with my mother and all the tests and everything she would do, and hundreds of caregivers sitting in the same boat, but not one system that we could rely upon with one another, So it was just this very, not only destabilizing experience with your parent being sick, but now also destabilizing in that there's no system or process or something that you can rely upon.
Yeah, and who has time to read all that and who and remember it, right? And things change so quickly. Like it really, you need a navigator.
When you're caring for someone in their time of need, it also highlights your strengths and your weaknesses. And we can drop down into denial about what are the things that we can take care of and what are the things that are just really outside of our scope of control and scope of capabilities. And denying or thinking that you can do more than you can is just as destructive as thinking you can't do something when you can take it on. And denial will eat away at your self-confidence, or it might overinflate your ability to do things or your ability to think about doing things. And so it's complex. Don't for a second think that we are immune from the need to preserve ourselves. I don't for one second think that it's an all or nothing situation. And so what's really, really important is having awareness of what our capabilities are and checking in on a regular basis. And the last thing I want to say on denial is that it'll play tricks with your mind. Denial will play tricks with your mind. As I was preparing for this episode and looking at pictures from the time when I was caring for my mom and even the time caring for my dad, and just looking at them, I can never say it objectively, but more objectively than when I was in the moment, I was shocked at how sick they looked in those pictures. And when I was in the moment of caring for them, when I was in the trenches with them, when I was there on a minute-to-minute basis, I couldn't see it. I was immune to it. And denial served me in that way because it didn't allow me to see what the illnesses were doing to their bodies. And it allowed me to stay in the place where I could love them and draw on my strength for them. If you like what you heard today, please follow, rate, or subscribe to Lead with Love on the podcast platform of your choosing. We'll see you back here next week.